The committee will come to order. The only item on our agenda today is H.R. 4923, the American Manufacturing Competitiveness Act of 2016. I'll begin with an opening statement. Last week, I was honored to join Ranking Member Levin, Trade Chairman Reichert, Ranking Member Rangel, and 15 other colleagues in introducing the bipartisan American Manufacturing Competitiveness Act of 2016 with an identical Senate companion bill. We worked together constructively on this issue for years, and we listened to our constituents throughout the entire process. Time and time again, Americans made it clear they want a new MTP process to help manufacturers. At the same time, they also want a process that's completely transparent and accountable. The bill we are acting on today reflects their important priorities. First, our bill will create an effective process for the House to consider manufacturing tax cuts that will help our local job creators compete in the global market. Under the new process, our local manufacturers will regain their competitive edge over manufacturers from other countries. Soon, it will be easier for our manufacturers to lower costs, create new jobs, increase U.S. production, reduce prices, and help grow our economy. This bill is a win for local American job creators and a win for American consumers. Second, our bipartisan bill creates an open and transparent process that allows the American people to see every part of this process. Our bill first upholds our House and firmly upholds our House earmark rules because members of Congress will no longer introduce bills to begin the MTB process. Instead, the process will begin exclusively through petitions made by local American businesses to the independent, nonpartisan International Trade Commission. Fortunately, the reaction to our bill has confirmed that we struck just the right balance. Let me mention briefly the positive reception this bill has received from a range of businesses and organizations. U.S. manufacturing groups, such as the National Association of Manufacturers, praises the bill and says, "We strongly urge Congress to eliminate distortions in the U.S. tariff code that are undermining the competitiveness and job growth of our industries by passing the American Manufacturing Competitiveness Act of 2016 as expeditiously as possible." The American Chemistry Council explains how the new process will, quote, help reduce or eliminate hundreds of import duties on raw materials that chemical manufacturers rely on for innovation, but which are not produced in the U.S. Conservative organizations such as National Taxpayers Union, Taxpayers for Common Sense, and the Council for Citizens Against Government Waste also praise the bill and say that this bill adds, quote, unprecedented transparency, as all correspondence between businesses, the ITC, and Congress would be made easily available to the public in real time. And Americans for Tax Reform say the bottom line is that MTBs are a vital tool for American competitiveness. I applaud your work to reform this process to make clear that MTBs are a tax cut, not an earmark. As we all know, it's not every day in Washington that we introduce a bill that has such strong support from local job creators of all sizes and members of Congress across the political spectrum. Thanks again to so many of our colleagues' leadership and support throughout this process. In particular, I'd like to thank Trade Subcommittee Chairman Reichert, as well as Representative Teaberry, the former chairman of Trade Subcommittee, Mr. Reed, Mr. Renacci, ranking members and leaders Levin and Rangel, and Representatives Blumenauer, Pascrell, and Davis. I'd also like to thank Representatives Mark Walker, Tom McClintock, Todd Rokita, Mick Mulvaney, and Rod Blum for their considerable leadership throughout this process. We should all be proud of this legislation, excited to see it move out of our committee today. I now recognize the ranking member Levin, co-sponsor of this important legislation, for a statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I support this bill. I just wanted to go back a little bit in history because it's often instructive. And my view and the view of most of my colleagues today is, as the saying goes, better late than never. The last time Congress passed an MTB bill was in 2010, when we Democrats were in the majority. The MTB was a legitimate exercise of congressional authority, and the process we had in place worked very well. It had been developed over the years on a bipartisan basis. We received input directly from the public, from the administration, and from the independent International Trade Commission. That input ensured, first and foremost, that there was no domestic production in competition with the imported products included in the bill. Not only was the process rigorous, it was transparent. And as Mr. Rango and others of us are so proud, the Sunlight Foundation praised our work as, in quotes, transparency done right. I remember the vote in 2010 very well. Unfortunately, the Republican leadership objected to the MTB and didn't want it to come to the floor. When we brought it to the floor, the support was overwhelming. Many Republican members switched their vote to yes. I think voting based on their constituent needs, not argument over process. 378 members voted for the bill. Only 42 Republicans and 1 Democrat voted no. So now it's almost 6 years later. We are just beginning to put in place a process for considering a future MTB bill. If everything goes right according to plan, Congress will pass the next MTB bill before the end of 2017, almost 5 years after the last MTB expired. That delay has been bad for U.S. manufacturers and U.S. manufacturing competitiveness. According to the National Association of Manufacturers, U.S. companies have had to pay $748 million each year in additional duties. NAM estimates that those additional duties cost our economy $2 billion annually. But we need to move forward now without further delay. In my judgment, this new process may not be preferable to the one in the past, but it is acceptable. I will therefore actively support this legislation. And Mr. Chairman and my colleagues, I look forward to finally making progress again on the MTB. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. The committee will now proceed to consideration of H.R. 4923 without objection. The measure will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. At this time, I offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute, which was distributed in advance along with the green sheet explaining it. Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be considered as read, open for amendment at any point, and considered base text for purpose of amendment. I'll now turn to Angela Eller, Chief Trade Counsel and Staff Director of the Trade Subcommittee, to provide a technical description of the amendment in the nature of a substitute with an emphasis on changes made since introduction. I ask that members hold their questions until after her presentation. Ms. Eller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The American Manufacturing Competitiveness Act of 2016 has several sections, and I will go through them briefly and highlight the changes that were made in the substitute. Section 2 establishes certain congressional findings, specifically relating to the value of the miscellaneous tariff bill for manufacturing, the necessity of complying with rules, and noting that when the process that's laid out in the bill is followed, it is consistent with the letter and intent of the rules of the House and the Senate and other related guidance. Section 2 also expresses a sense of Congress that Congress should, not later than 90 days after receiving the final ITC report, vote on an MTB. Section 3 sets out in detail the process for consideration of duty suspensions and reductions, beginning with the initiation of a process by the International Trade Commission requesting members of the public who can demonstrate that they are likely beneficiaries to submit petitions. And it also establishes the information that each petition must contain. The rest of the section establishes the ITC review process and deadlines. Section 3B3C also lays out the requirements for the ITC preliminary report to Congress. And then in addition to that, providing that the ITC shall consider any information submitted by the committees. After that point, the ITC prepares a final report to update the preliminary report and to state whether each provision is administrable, has an estimated cost that does not exceed $500,000, and is available to any person that imports the product. Section 3B3F provides that the Ways and Means and Finance Committees may exclude petitions from an MTB based on the ITC's recommendation, an objection by a member of Congress, or a finding of domestic production. However, the committees cannot add products that did not either receive a favorable recommendation from the ITC or undergo the processes required by the section. In the amendment in the nature of a substitute, it's also provided that the committees shall adjust the amount of a duty reduction or suspension to assure that the loss in revenue does not exceed $500,000 as estimated by the Congressional Budget Office. Section 3C requires the Secretary of Commerce, in consultation with the U.S. Customs and Border Protection and other relevant federal agencies, to submit to the ITC and the committees a report on each petition. Section 4 requires a report from the ITC on the effects of duty suspensions and reductions on the U.S. economy, due 12 months after the date of enactment of an MTB. One aspect of this report relates to the effects on the U.S. economy of duty suspensions and reductions enacted pursuant to the Act. The second element is that the ITC shall also solicit and append to the report recommendations with respect to those domestic industry sectors that might benefit from permanent duty suspensions or reductions. Section 5 contains the requirement that the chairman of the Committee on Ways and Means include a list of limited tariff benefits in a miscellaneous trade bill in the report to accompany the bill or in the congressional record, consistent with Clause 9 of Rule 21 of the House. The bill also provides equivalent Senate procedures. Section 5C establishes that the section is enacted by Congress as an exercise of the rulemaking authority of the House and Senate. Section 6 states that judicial review is precluded, and Section 7 contains definitions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Are there any technical questions about the amendment and the nature of substitute?
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Levin?
Angela, a question. This has all been worked out in advance, I think. The bill requires the Department of Commerce to submit a report to Congress on the MTB petitions, in quotes, in consultation with the U.S. Customs and Border Protection and other relevant federal agencies. In the past, was USTR considered a relevant federal agency?
Yes, it was, Mr. Levin.
Thank you. And was it permitted to submit its views?
Yes, it was.
Is there anything in this bill that would change that past practice?
No, Mr. Levin, there is not. In fact, Section 3C specifically provides for administration views.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. McDermott, Dr. McDermott?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to understand how this actually works, because I had an example from my district some years ago where we were importing goose down into Seattle to make all-weather clothing for mountaineering and whatever. And there was some problems in the tariffs with the Chinese in terms of bringing that goose down in. I put that forward as a issue to be dealt with in this bill, in the miscellaneous tariff bill. And that was then later considered an earmark by some as a use of the system. Will I be able to bring from my city or from my manufacturers areas where they think there's a problem and submit them, or what will be the process that I have to go through? All the members here on the committee are going to be faced with this because we all have manufacturers who have tariff problems. So how do I come forward with that from my goose down importers and put it in front of the committee and get it into the bill? What's the process?
The process, Mr. McDermott, is that any company that is a likely beneficiary is able to petition directly to the International Trade Commission and to put forward information to the ITC that it needs, that it's in need of this relief.
So there will still be no ability of a member to bring an issue to the ITC and say, I think you should look at this issue.
In terms of initiating the process, the bill provides that that process shall be initiated only by a beneficiary who petitions to the ITC directly.
So,
in other words, the process does not begin through member initiation of a bill, through an introduction of a bill.
so it's us saying to our constituent, I can't do anything for you. Go over to the ITC and make a recommendation or make a request, and then I just stand back and wait and see what the ITC decides.
Well, I imagine that members would be making known, if this provision does become law, that it does exist, and telling manufacturers about the availability of this procedure.
Would the gentleman yield?
Yes.
This question was raised, Jim, and I think it's correct to say that while the company would have to initiate it, that it would be appropriate for any member to submit a letter to the ITC in support.
A letter simply saying, I want you to review this, or I recommend that you accept it, or what level of
I think
influence
anything,
do I
as
have
I
on
understand
the
it,
ITC?
as I understand it, this is a bit sensitive question because of the way this is now framed. As I understand it, as is true generally, a member could send a letter to the ITC in support of a constituent's request.
So would this mean that in the appropriations process that I could then send a letter to the appropriation of the MILCON subcommittee and say, I recommend that you consider the construction of X, Y, and Z in my district? I mean, are we opening the door really to the whole earmark question again? Because we're giving us the capacity now to approach and to push something from our district, which presently we don't have. I have no mechanism by which I can deal with my exporters in my district, nor do I have any with my infrastructure projects or anything else that I may think is important. Are we setting, or maybe they'll take another piece of legislation like this for the appropriations process, but it looks to me like you're opening the whole of the earmark question by this particular piece of legislation. I approve of it. I'm going to support it. I always thought taking away earmarks was silly. I mean, members of Congress should be able to advocate for their constituents, but tell me where the process will be on the appropriations.
Well, Mr. McDermott, this provision, this legislation is consistent, is designed to be consistent with House rules with respect to earmarks and limited tariff benefits, because no member introduces a bill to initiate the process, and because under Rule 21, Clause 9, the chairman would cause to be published a list of all limited tariff benefits that are included in the MTB. Those are the requirements that are in the rules, and this bill is compliant with those rules.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Are there any other questions?
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, sir.
if it's appropriate, I'd like to have a colloquy with you.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Chairman, I'm sure you would agree that it's essential that each MTB provision is non-controversial and that the MTB does not contain controversial provisions. Will you confirm your understanding that, as in the past, we will consider a provision to be controversial if, for instance, a member of Congress objects to the provision or if a domestic producer objects to the provision?
Yes, as in the past, I'll consider an individual MTB provision to be controversial if, for example, a member of Congress or a domestic producer objects to the provision.
Thank you. And Mr. Chairman, and if a provision is deemed to be controversial in nature, will you also confirm that you will consider such a provision to be ineligible for inclusion in the final MTB legislation?
I can confirm that point as well. I'll consider any provisions deemed to be controversial in nature to be ineligible for inclusion in the final MTB legislation consistent with our past practice.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Eller, to the point of Dr. McDermott, this legislation, which has been worked on by a number of members throughout the years, and again, I appreciate the bipartisan work that's been done here, the leadership of Chairman Reichert, Mr. Tiberi, Mr. Reed, and Renacci, others who've been part of this discussion. We've been very careful to firmly uphold the current House earmark ban. A critical part of that is to ensure that ITC begins this provision, and with a, as I understand it, a 60-day notice that they are considering this, which is in fact an invitation for our local businesses to petition the ITC to begin the process. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct, Mr. Chairman.
So it's no different in a sense than a grant process that occurs through the administration where a call is made, invitation to submit an application for a grant or to bid for a competitive product or service for the government. In that case, how a member weighs in is irrelevant compared to the provision and the initiation begins at the ITC. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And all this is transparent from the initial call to the provisions that are submitted to the analysis by the ITC, the public comments from the public, the recommendations from the ITC to Congress, our deliberations and submittal to the House. All of that is both firmly within the earmark ban, fully open and transparent throughout the process, almost unprecedented, and retains Congress's constitutional role over tariffs. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Thank you. Any other technical questions?
Let me just add, Chairman, that as I understand it, I mean, I think we know what's going on here. There's a rule that never should have applied to the MTBs, so that when members write letters, and I would encourage them to do this so that they can represent a constituent, that any such letters will also become part of the public domain. So we'll maintain the total transparency of this process, right?
Yes, that's correct. Anything that is submitted would be part of the public record.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, Dr. McDermott.
I would like to ask. Mr. Chairman, would you answer a question, or would you,
Yes,
because
sir.
what you just said, you will be the final decider of whether a particular provision is left in there, because the ITC will have said it's okay or whatever, and then you will make the final. It seems like that makes you similar to a cardinal in the appropriations process. If I write a letter and say there should be an addition to the University of Washington in the form of a certain building, and I think you should consider it, he has the ability ultimately to say, no, there's no money for that or whatever. How is this process different than that? Is this, or maybe splitting a hair here, but I'm looking for where we get back into the game in terms of the appropriations process.
Well, this is clearly not the appropriations process, and the ITC makes these recommendations to us as a committee. And under House rules, in order for this process to go from this committee to the House floor, I have to first certify that there are no spending earmarks in this package. Secondly, certify that these are limited tariff benefits. Making those certifications and sending the measure to the floor is dramatically different than the appropriations process.
If I come, I appreciate your letting us explore this a little. If Mr. Tiberi puts one forward and I come to you and say, I don't like that one. Does that take it off the list?
In this statute, in the bill that we are considering right now, yes, it does. If a member objects, if there is a domestic producer, if there is a controversy with that provision, this committee can subtract from that recommended list from the ITC, but not add. And that's fully within the current earmark ban.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir. Mr. Rangel's right.
Appreciate the atmosphere in which we are doing this. You say we can strike, but we can't add. How far can we go if, assuming there was a unanimous concern by all of the members of this committee for a particular manufacturer that was very important to our national security, and it was vital that they would be able to import some materials in order to be successful, and we agreed. To what extent can we express our concerns, and therefore the Congress and our constituent concerns, to the ICC without violating any provisions of the law?
You know, I think it's important in this process to weigh in with your views during the ITC analysis of these provisions. And Ms. Eller, correct me if I'm wrong, we've directed the ITC to send their recommendations to us publicly and to classify the provisions that have been submitted to them to inform our committee about their analysis. This actually is to Mr. Rangel's question. Those categories are what?
Those categories are whether the ITC recommends inclusion without modification, whether the ITC recommends inclusion with specified technical changes, adjustments in product scope, or adjustments in the amount of the duty reduction, whether the ITC recommends not including because the petition did not meet the petition requirements or the petitioner was not a likely beneficiary, whether the ITC otherwise recommends not including.
So, Mr. Rangel, that is how the recommendation, again, publicly and transparently, will come to the committee. We'll weigh those provisions based on those categories. At that point, we will not have the ability to add a provision that was not included, not recommended in that list. Is that correct, Ms. Eller?
That's correct.
Right.
My question, however, was before they make an ironclad decision whether or not it's possible for this committee to make bipartisan recommendations to the ITC.
Ms. Eller, I assume that any member of Congress can make their views
please.
known.
I hate to interrupt.
But as the committee,
No, as a committee, if we agree, and it's possible, I hope, that this is not a partisan issue, and I'm just saying we consider it a national security issue, and we all agree, and we're merely telling the ITC that we want you to review this very carefully. Is that violating the spirit of the law?
you know, again, whether it's individually as a group and transparently, I believe we are allowed to weigh in on the merits of provision. Ms. Eller, correct me if I'm wrong.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. In fact, the legislation specifically provides that once the ITC has made its preliminary report to Congress, which would be publicly available, Section 3B3D provides that the ITC shall consider any information submitted by the committees, and then the ITC would issue its final report.
Well, I was saying before they made an ironclad, well, not so ironclad, before they made a decision, but I'm pushing you, and I guess there is no answer to that question.
No, I think you've actually got it. Yes, we can weigh in during the process, even after they've sent us their preliminary report. But once the final report is sent to us, we are then in the process of subtraction of provisions, but to stay firmly within the House earmark ban, we are no longer allowed to add a provision from that final report.
I understand that. Are you saying that you think we can weigh in before the ITC submits its final list, not after they did, which you made that very, very clear, but before they do, we as a committee, and I'm not talking about individuals, as a committee, are you saying that it's your understanding that we can submit this this request to the ITC before they finally submit to the Congress their findings.
That's correct, Mr. Rangel. The legislation provides an opportunity for the committee to submit views with respect to products that were in the preliminary report in the category for which the ITC recommends not inclusion.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Would you yield?
Yes.
Because I think the legislative history should be clear on this. At any point, any member can communicate with the ITC. I think we discussed that earlier. So, Mr. Rangel, I think your apt question is answered this way. If we can submit for the record to the ITC our views individually, we could do it as a committee.
Okay.
We're going kind of around in a circle here to avoid the rule that's been interpreted that it applies to the MTB when we didn't like the rule, we opposed it. But this is a way to, within that rule, provide as much scope for members of Congress as allowed by the rule. We would abolish that rule if we had the power to do so, but we don't. And so I think the answer should be clear that, Mr. Chairman, if at any point we as a full committee wanted to inform the ITC of our position on a particular request from any party, we have the power to do that.
We do. I would just sort of reclaiming my time, also make the point, though, the ITC is an independent, nonpartisan agency. We'll be conducting the analysis based on the specific provision, the analysis of domestic production, and making recommendations as to any fine-tuning of the provisions as submitted to them. So that final report will be submitted by an independent, a bipartisan agency to us.
Yes, that's correct, Mr.
Thank you.
Chairman.
Other
Mr.
questions?
Chairman? Yes.
Oh, yes.
I just
Mr.
thank
Dog.
you very much for the clarification you provided, and I just want to pursue it a little further. First, ITC will have a searchable database where you can search by who requested it and anyone who benefits from it.
Ms. Heller?
Yes, Mr. Doggett, the ITC will be setting up a database. In fact, it's required by statute.
And all of this will be public, so it's
Yes, sir.
not just available to this committee, but anyone, anywhere who wants to know about this.
Yes, that's correct.
And then I know that there have been a number of these requests on hold for some time as we considered what alternative would be appropriate given the earmark rule. There's a backlog of them. As a practical matter, what kind of general timetable would you expect in terms of when we will get the first of these to review specifics?
Mr. Doggett, according to the provisions that are laid out in the legislation, the ITC would commence the process, if this were to pass, the ITC would commence the process in October of 2016, receive petitions, conduct its analysis, issue its preliminary and final reports. The final report would be due either July or August of 2017, depending on how the provisions play out. And then at that point, the report would be available to Congress for its consideration.
And will the preliminary report come then to this committee and the Senate Finance Committee for our review?
Yes, sir.
And
In
that
fact, it would be
report
public.
will include all of the information that on each one that they recommended, who will benefit, who asked for it, and how much money is involved.
Yes, that's correct.
And as far as the beneficiary, will this include the direct company that is receiving the lowered tariff and any indirect beneficiaries that are anticipated?
Likely beneficiaries are defined in the legislation as, I'll read you the definition, as an individual or entity likely to utilize or benefit directly from the utilization of an article that is the subject of a petition for a duty suspension or reduction.
So under the timetable you've outlined, then about when do you think, assuming we get this legislation passed with the bipartisan support that it has, that we will be reviewing that interim report?
Assuming that this legislation passes and the process begins in October as laid out in the legislation, Congress would get the final report in July or August of 2017, and at that point could commence its consideration.
That's the final report, though. Would we be considering and reviewing the preliminary report at an earlier time?
Yes. The preliminary report, I can give you that date.
Is that within the 150-day timetable?
Yes, the preliminary report would be 120 days after the ITC published the petition, so we could expect that around May 15th or June 15th, depending on, there's an extension provision that's provided.
So
that's when you would
it's
get
a couple months before the Congress would actually have it to vote on?
Right, because after the preliminary report comes out, then the ITC has 60 days to issue the final report.
Great. And then, Mr. Chairman, you indicated in response to an earlier query, does it operate then under basically a unanimous consent process?
In essence, for the provisions, sort of the colloquy Mr. Levin and I just had, there are 3 instances where members can object, a provision is controversial in some manner, or there is a domestic producer which would, in effect, knock that provision off the list.
And that objection could be made after the final report has been filed?
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Well, I might add, if I could, there is, within this process, we want to make sure there is both independent analysis and transparency in a timetable, so that there is a timetable specifically for public comment to open up through this, a timetable for ITC to report that preliminary to us and back. So we try to create a very open process and timetable that we're all very aware of, and I think going forward we'll get very knowledgeable about the process.
Just one more question about that then. So I understand the timetable going forward till next summer. After that, will this be done on an annual basis?
In this provision, correct me if I'm wrong, we direct it to occur in 3 years, a second process to occur beyond that. What would be the answer, Ms. Eller?
The legislation talks about the initial process to begin in October and then another one 3 years later. So it sets out 2 processes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ms. Eller.
Yep. Other questions? Does anyone wish to strike the last word? Dr. McDermott?
Mr. Chairman, I think that one of the issues that this whole issue raises, and I'm glad we're doing it, because I think it's a good bill. I'm going to support it, as I say, but the Congress is essentially giving its decision-making power to the ITC. They're saying you can put on the list who you want. We're giving away our power as a body to an executive branch agency. The same is true in the appropriations process, where we raise the money in this committee, give it to the Appropriations Committee, and they appropriate it, but they just send big bags of money to the executive without recommendation from the Congress as to how any of that money is spent. That's what the earmark process was really all about. And what troubles me about this is that we as the Congress are giving away our prerogatives to make decisions around how the money that we raise from the American people is spent. You're trusting President Obama to spend all the money that we appropriate in ways that make sense to him, not as in ways that make sense to us. So we would like an extension to our rapid transit system in Seattle. So the Transportation Committee sends a bunch of money to the Transportation Department, and they decide who's going to get it. We have not one thing to say about where that money goes, may all go to someplace other than where it ought to go, which is to Seattle. But the fact is that that's the process we're setting up here, and I think that's really what's the bigger issue that you're raising with this bill. I think that ultimately we as the Congress are going to have to look at what kind of process are we going to have on the appropriation side that's similar to this, because in this bill we're limited to $500,000. That's all we can spend. You can't put something on, I think that's what I heard, was that $500,000 was the limit of the cost of one of these tariff barriers. Am I correct, Ms. Elder?
Yes, $500,000 per provision.
Okay, so my folks who get goose down from somewhere, they can't get more than a $500,000 benefit. We're giving away that ability to the ITC to decide whether or not it should be spent or not. And I personally am jealous about what the House's powers are. That's why I think that this is it's good you're bringing this issue up again. I think it should come up. We should be sure that our friends on the Appropriations Committee understand what we're doing here so that they can begin to devise their own method by which we can recreate the ability for us to have some impact on how the money that we take from the American public. I hear everybody saying it's the public's money. Well, we take it, and then we say to the president, do whatever you want with it. And I find that an uncomfortable position to be in, and I think that ultimately this is a good start on starting that discussion. So I applaud you for bringing this bill up.
Thank you, Mr. McDermott. If the gentleman would yield just for 30 seconds. You know, I think it's important here that to make the case we are not changing the earmark ban within the House. If people want to have that discussion, you know, the rules package each year I think is the best opportunity to have that discussion. In this case, it's a three-step process. Initiating the MTB process through the ITC publicly, the ITC analyzing it and seeking public comment as it has in the past. Then step 3 is the exercise of our constitutional role, because it is the committee that takes those recommendations, puts this in the MTB proposal, and begins the regular order that we would as with any bill. In my view, that retains our most critical constitutional role in this, which is determining that final bill in effect and beginning the regular order process. Mr. Paulson?
To move to strike the last word?
Yes, sir.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I just want to thank you for your work on this this issue. I'm actually really pleased that we're moving forward on this. We're taking a big step to actually help domestic manufacturers in Minnesota and across the country. I know American businesses have been looking forward to this because they will once again have an opportunity to compete and obtain that duty relief on the components that are essential to all the products that they manufacture and ultimately sell every day. And this is real money. This is real money that truly makes a difference for American businesses and American workers. And I would argue it's also a pretty good bang for the buck, just given the fact that thousands of jobs and billions of dollars in economic gains are going to come out of this for what boils down to a few $1 million in tax relief or tariff relief. And while I believe it's important to revive the MTB process as soon as possible, sooner, it would have been nice to have had this pass through. I do really greatly appreciate all the work that you've done and on a bipartisan basis with all the different stakeholders to make sure that we get this process right for the committee today. It seems to be straightforward, it seems to be transparent, and I look forward to passing it to conclusion. Yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Reichert, Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Levin, also for your work and leadership on this issue. And you know, it's been discussed for decades. Congress has considered MTBs to boost the competitiveness of American manufacturers. Although, as has been stated already, this is not a perfect process. There are those of us who agree with some of the comments coming from the other side that we feel there is a constitutional responsibility on our part to represent our constituents in a much more vocal way and straightforward way. But at this point in history, that is not an option. And so I think this really is an opportunity for us to come together, and I hear some bipartisan support for this, come together and support those businesses across the country that that need our help, that have been paying that $748 million in additional taxes. And we now today have an opportunity to end that practice. Especially at last week's hearing in the subcommittee, in the trade subcommittee, we heard some very compelling stories from manufacturers across the country about how MTBs have supported their growth and success. They also shared with us what a loss of the MTB has meant for them. For family-owned Glen Raven Company out of North Carolina, it is paying taxes on necessary inputs that their foreign competitors don't have to pay. For family-owned Ping from Arizona, that's the golf clubs, if anybody's I'm not a golfer, but golf bags and golf clubs. The tariffs on components used in their building of a golf club is higher than the tariff on an entire golf club manufactured elsewhere. So I'm very pleased that we have a solution to this problem that fully complies with our House rules and has such strong bipartisan support in both chambers. And that's unusual in this day and age. So I think we ought to celebrate that. I also want to take a moment, Mr. Chairman, to congratulate and thank the staff. Ms. Ellard and the Trade Committee staff has, you know, worked very, very long and hard on putting this together, and appreciate all her hard work. So I look forward to seeing this bill pass the House floor soon and starting this process in 2017. I yield back.
Thank you. I'd like to turn to the amendments if there are any, but does anyone else wish to strike the last word? Are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of substitute? If there are no further amendments, questions on the adoption of the amendment in the nature of substitute, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. The opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. I'll now recognize Mr. Johnson for the purpose of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee favorably report H.R. 4923 as amended to the House of Representatives.
Questions on favorably reporting the bill H.R. 4923 is amended to the House. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed signify by saying no. The opinion of the chair is the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to, and H.R. 4923 is amended, is ordered favorably reported to the House. Without objection, I ask that staff be authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the bill. Members have 2 additional days to file with the committee clerk supplemental, additional, dissenting, or minority views. There being no further business before the committee stands adjourned.